Is that person male or female?
Males and females, it's very sharp. It is a sharp distinction.
Not at all. We can look at the broad spectrum of intersex conditions and of transsexual persons who medically transition, all the different ways that our genes interact with one another to create certain sex traits. There is so much ambiguity, especially within the intersex population. For example, people with ovotesticular syndrome who have both ovarian tissue and testicular tissue. Some of these people even producing both sperm and eggs throughout their life.
Okay, so that was trans activist Nominal Naomi, who was responding to something I said, which is that there is a clear dividing line between males and females, and that intersex conditions do not constitute an argument for there being more than two sexes, or that there's a continuum between sexes, or an argument for the idea that we can't clearly distinguish between males and females. And this is something trans activists do all the time. They constantly are appropriating intersex or disorders of sexual development in order to prop up this idea that non-binary is like valid, or that males can turn into females if they go on hormones. We're trying to confuse or trying to blur the line between males and females in order to justify things like trans women competing in the female sports category or something like this. But if you actually look at disorders of sexual development, they very clearly fall into the male developmental pathway or the female developmental pathway. This idea that intersex constitutes an argument for there being more than two sexes is just not valid. There's a male pathway and a female pathway. And pretty much every disorder of sexual development falls into one or the other pathways. And it's not it's not ambiguous. And it just constitutes like a basic logical fallacy. Um, to like argue that it does. And even in the case of ovotesticular syndrome, if you actually look at ovotesticular syndrome, one, this is extremely rare, very, very rare. Like they say that there's been like documented like 500 cases or something like this. So it is extremely rare. Yeah, it's like more than 525 cases has been documented. So there's like 8 billion people on the planet. And you're going to say that, the difference between males and females is not clear because of these like extremely rare cases. And furthermore, even within ovotesticular syndrome, Naomi said that there's been cases where people produce both sperm and egg. Well, that's actually not the case. You usually produce either eggs or sperm, but not both. So the gonad most likely to function is the ovary. The ovotestes show evidence of ovulation in 50% of cases. Spermatogenesis has only been observed in solitary testes and not in the testicular portions of ovotestes. So, in these cases, it is not true that you are producing both eggs and sperm. You might have ovotissue and testicular tissue, but both sets of those organs are not functioning properly. Therefore, according to the gamete account of male and female sex, in regards to what defines being male or female, you can still put these people into a category in regards to whether or not they are male or female. And even if it was the case that there was a perfect ambiguity in these examples, that would not constitute an argument for the idea that there isn't a clear dividing line between males and females, because that is an example of the continuum fallacy or the Sorites paradox. Take a look at this. Would we want to say that there is no sharp difference between a bald person and a person with hair? Do we want to say that, there's not a sharp difference between these two categories? No, we want to say there is a sharp difference, that we can clearly distinguish between bald people and people with hair. We are not confused in regards to who is bald and who has hair. This is a clear example. And just because there are cases where someone has a little bit of hair, they're not fully bald, they have a little bit of hair. That doesn't mean that the category of bald and hairy are like somehow invalid. Similarly, with the Sorites paradox, we can say that when do we count as a heap? So suppose we started adding 1 grain of sand at a time to this empty ground. At what point can we say that there's now a heap? Or if we start taking away 1 grain of sand, when do we want to say that there is no longer a heap? This will lead to what's called in philosophy the Sorites paradox, whereas there's a continuum between being a heap and a non heap. But that doesn't mean that the concept of heap is meaningless or the concept of non heap is meaningless. Similarly, even if it were the case in these extremely rare conditions with the testicular syndrome that there isn't a sharp distinction between male and female, that does not mean that the concepts of male and female do not have sharp definitions, nor does it constitute an argument that there's like a third sex or an infinite amount of sexes or a continuum between the sexes, nor does it constitute an argument that like non-binary identity is valid, or that trans women can turn into females by taking hormones. So if we look in Wikipedia, they talk about the continuum fallacy, or the fallacy of the beard, the line drawing fallacy, or the decision point fallacy. It is an informal fallacy related to the Sorites paradox. That's the heap paradox. Both fallacies cause one to erroneously reject a vague claim simply because it is not as precise as one would like it to be. Vagueness alone does not necessarily imply invalidity. The fallacy is the argument that two states or conditions cannot be considered distinct or do not exist at all, because between them there exists a continuum of states. So we cannot say that male and female are not sharply distinguished between each other just because there exists an extremely rare condition where there is both ova and testicular tissue, even though, as I already mentioned, in the ova testicular case, it is still not the case that those people produce both sperms and eggs, in which we could still demarcate whether they belong to the female or the male sex, in regards to the gamete account, in regards to the capability to produce sperm or egg. So this is just a confused way of thinking, and the trans activists are always doing this. They're always appropriating the intersex conditions in order to prop up the trans ideological position. And if you actually talk to people with intersex conditions, people who have disorders of sexual development, they don't like this appropriation by the trans activists to prop up gender ideology. They don't like, having their medical conditions used to prop up this, trans ideological talking point that there are more than two sexes, or that, trans women can play on, the female sports team, or that, are using it as an argument for the validity of like, trans identity or something like this, because these are distinct things. And as I showed before, intersex conditions clearly fall within the male or the female category, or the male or female pathway in like most cases. So this is just like bad argumentation, and it's ideological. It's appropriating a medical condition to prop up the trans ideology. And this needs to stop. And it is not an argument for that, or the idea that there are more than two sexes. Okay, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Take care.